Hello everyone and welcome back to Flashpoint 2020. Today we will be analyzing the third motion, which is, in times of crises, this house prefers a technocracy to a democracy. I highly suggest everyone to pause this video and think for yourselves what are the major arguments you would run for proposition for the motion. Later, I will be providing you an analysis on what a proposition case would look like. Hopefully you all had some time to think about the motion. Here are some things I would consider when looking at this motion. The first is the context implied. This motion specifically limits you to think about what happens in the times of crises, so your arguments should be relevant very specifically to those crises. The second thing to think about is that this is a this house prefers motion. We're looking on a comparative basis why a technocracy is better than a democracy. This also means that a technocracy doesn't have to solve all the problems, but if it solves more problems than a democracy, it is already sufficient for proposition to take that debate. By now, you should be very familiar with debating and know how to construct a case. The first thing to do is to define some key terms. Here it is very obvious that you should be defining two key terms. The first is what is a technocracy, and the second is what is a democracy. Here, we will define a technocracy as a system where governmental decisions are made by ministers chosen by their technical expertise and background. So, for example, if we were dealing with a crisis such as a pandemic, such as COVID-19, we would be having ministers such as professional doctors leading on the decisions to handle that crisis. As for a democracy, it is a system where governmental decisions are made by public referendums or elected ministers if they win a majority vote. So there are two scenarios here. Either the whole public gets to vote on issues such as whether they would want to be in a lockdown, or it would be by elected ministers voted on by the public to handle those decisions on what to do during that crisis. The second thing to do is to do a bit of characterization. Now that we have some basic definitions, we still want to know where this debate is set and what are the kinds of crises we are talking about in this debate. Here, we would characterize the idea of crises as disasters that a large population is prone to and also cause significant economic damage or a lot of casualties. And it will probably also require a certain level of knowledge to decide the measures to be taken during the crisis, so it's not easily resolvable. So this could be, for example, a pandemic like COVID-19, or some natural disasters like famines or floods, or even just an economic crisis during something like a recession. We think all of these things would be crises that proposition would be advocating for a technocracy. Now we can finally move on to the arguments. Here we will look at two directions. The first is on practical impacts. This answers the question of what is the best outcome and how do we achieve that outcome. The second direction we'll look at later is principal justifications, but now let's focus on the practical impacts. The first kind of argument we are going to talk about is how technocracies are more effective in solving the crisis. So that's the topic sentence. After that, we will need analysis points to prove that topic sentence. So how does a technocracy actually solve a crisis? Here, we will have to think of the features, the unique features of a technocracy and how that is so good in trying to save more lives. Here, the analysis is twofold. The first is that technocrats, so the people, the ministers selected based on their technical expertise in a technocracy, have the ability and means to help the country practically. So this means, for example, that they have the educational background, they have the years of training, they also have a lot of experience in that particular discipline or field in order to help that country. This means logically following that they're able to they're able to design better policies, they're able to have better management systems to execute those policies, and those policies are more likely to benefit the public, and it's going to be you're going to be able to save more lives therefore. The second layer of analysis is that technocrats communicate better with those who share the same field of expertise in the government. So, for example, if we were dealing with something like an economic recession, if the people who are leading the decision making and also the people who were actually executing those policies were all economists, they would probably get along better, they would have better discussions to think of what are the better policies in order to solve the crises. They can also tweak and refine the existing policies, and those things are more likely to help the public and eventually solve the crisis. Conversely, democracies are not as effective in solving the crisis. Once again, we'll be linking this with the unique features of democracies to prove why democracies may not be as suitable to solve severe issues such as a pandemic or an economic recession. Once again, the analysis is twofold. The first is that average individuals are less informed about the situation. Thus, they are more likely to make poor decisions during referendums about deciding what measure should be implemented and whether that measure should be implemented in the first place. This might be because that they lack the educational background or technical expertise, but also they might be self-interested. They are unlikely to see the bigger picture, which means that they are not going to think of the country and how it will benefit the country overall. A real-life example would be something like the Greek debt crisis. To summarize this example very briefly, basically, in 2005, Greek, and probably up to now, Greek is suffering from a lot of economic problems. They are in debt and they have to repay a very large loan. In 2015, a referendum was held about whether Greece would accept some bailout conditions by a bunch of international institutions. The public rejected those bailout conditions. They voted no in that referendum because a lot of those conditions involved austerity measures which would cut public spending, and the people would therefore have less healthcare and all of that. This in turn meant that Greece was unable to repay those loans, and it continued to suffer economically. At the end of the day, Greece was actually suffered even heavier economic harms, and that actually harmed the public and the country overall. This is an example to show that if individuals are the ones to deal with a very severe crisis, they may not have enough information, or they might be way too self-interested in order to think of what is actually best to solve the crisis. The second layer of analysis is that elected ministers have other priorities. The reason for them being voted in the first place is because they appeal to certain voter bases, such as companies or lobby groups. Sometimes the measures in order to solve the crisis or prevent the crisis may bring harm towards those groups, and that's why some elected ministers don't want to implement those measures. For example, in the US, Trump currently during the COVID-19 crisis, Trump wanted to reopen the US economy as quickly as possible. He didn't want a lockdown to be implemented anymore, and that is because that a lockdown is likely to hurt the economy, and Trump knows that his voters care a lot about economic stability and they don't want to be in lockdown, and that's why he might sacrifice on more medically beneficial measures to solve the crisis in order to appeal to other priorities. This is unlikely going to be beneficial to solve the crisis. The last part of the argument is the impact. So why should we care that much about solving a crisis? If we do prove that a technocracy is more effective in solving the crisis, why is that the winning argument? Why is that the number one priority that we should care about? here we will justify why that is so important with two metrics. The first is number. So we think so many lives are in danger. A large population is prone to that crisis, and the numbers of casualties or the amount of economic damage also increases exponentially because of the crisis. If we do solve the crisis, we're able to save so many lives, we're able to prevent so much economic damage from happening, or reduce the economic damage. Those things are going to be very beneficial because of the sheer number of people we are going to save, and that's why solving a crisis is so important. The second metric is time. So lives are lost at a rapid rate. For example, in a pandemic, every day in a crisis is going to result in a huge number of people being infected, and solving the crisis is an urgent issue. Therefore, we need to be at the highest efficiency. We need to solve the crisis. It has to be our number one priority in order to stop this rate from continuing to increase, and in order to save the most people in the shortest amount of time. Now we move on to the principal justifications. If you have thought about this motion, you might think of some very obvious points that opposition can run. They might talk about how we should care more about the interests of the majority and how they have the right to decide because they are the ones living in that country, in that said country. Or you might think of the principle of democracy and why we should uphold it. For proposition, this might not be as good when talking about the principles, and you need to preempt that and show why those principles are still upheld in a technocracy, for example, or that those principles do not apply in general in times of the crises. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how in a technocracy the technocracy still reflect the interests of the majority. Here, we're going to prove that by saying that the majority of the people in a country, for example, will be harmed during that crisis. If it's in such a wide scope, it's labeled as a crisis, the majority is likely to be harmed. And it's probably going to harm them quite severely. If you were in a flood and your house is being flooded, the first thing you would want to do is to stop the flood. And therefore, you would then prove that the priority of the majority is to solve the crisis as soon as possible. And that is basically the same goal as the technocrats. In a technocracy, the ministers are going to want to solve that crisis as soon as possible. If it aligns with the interests of the majority, there is no problem. You still respect the interests of the majority. It's likely to be the same, so it doesn't matter in this scenario. The second thing I'm going to prove is that technocracy is still justified, because here it would be fine for us to bypass the right to vote or the principle of democracy. In other words, the principle of democracy doesn't really apply here. Why is that the case? Because the principle of democracy is based on the assumption that voters are informed. We can only have a democracy if all the voters know very clearly what is the best decision for them. And here, voters are usually unaware of the best solution to the crisis. Because maybe the crisis is very unexpected, it happened in a time where no one really was prepared for it. The crisis is very rare, it might only happen in a decade or even a century. Or the crisis is very complex, you're unable to understand what is happening, you don't know how to solve it. And if they are unaware of how to solve the crisis and what is the best thing to do, they're not able to make the best decisions for the country nor for themselves, which means that here in a democracy is unable to be upheld if they are not informed anyway. Here you can draw a parallel. For example, we do not give the right to vote to people who might not have the mental capacity to make decisions. For example, people under the age of 18, they are unable to understand the world and make the best decisions for themselves or for their country. Or for example, we do not provide the right to vote for people who are mentally insane. And because of all of these parallels, if opposition does agree that we cannot give the right to vote to those circumstances because it will only interfere with those who were actually informed, then in times of crises, a democracy is thus not justified, or not the principle of democracy doesn't apply, and a technocracy should be held instead. In conclusion, for the motion, in times of crises, this House prefers a technocracy over a democracy. For the proposition case, you might first want to consider the practical impacts, why a technocracy is more likely to solve the crises, and why democracies are not as suitable to solve the crisis, and therefore we should have a technocracy instead. You may also want to consider the principal justifications on why the interest of the majority is still upheld in a technocracy, and why the right to vote and the principle of democracy does not apply when in times of crises. And that concludes the presentation for today. I hope you found this presentation useful and it sparked your interest in debating. If you have any further questions, you may contact us on IG at FlashpointHK and on Facebook at Flashpoint. Thank you and have a great day.